Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you very much for joining us for the celebration of the launch of our edit collection, Metaphor, Sustainability, Transformation, Transdisciplinary Perspectives. My name is Jeremy Lally. I'm one of the co-editors of the collection, and I'll be introducing you to our various guests over the next 90 minutes or so, and we hope to share some thought-provoking stories and conversation with you. Before we begin properly, I want to mention some practical details. You're welcome to use the chat function to introduce yourselves and indeed to pose any questions that you might like to get addressed during the question and answer session at the end. Our co-editor Edmund Byrne will be keeping a watchful eye on the chat in order to gather questions. The event will be recorded and will be shared on the MARAI website after the event. So to formally begin proceedings, I'd like to call on a few people just to say a few words of introduction. So could I call on UCC's Vice President for Research and Innovation, Professor John Cryan, to say a few words, please.
Thanks, Ger, and thanks for inviting me to share in this event, and I'm thrilled to do so. And first of all, congratulations to all of the authors, to Ian, Edmund, Ger and Colin on this really important book and important example of showcasing sustainability research within UCC. As many people, most people on the call will probably know that sustainability research is one of our core areas within UCC, and we've recently launched our UCC Futures, which is really calling out what are the areas as an institution we want to highlight and promote, and we have future sustainabilities within that. And also to say that within the within UCC, how the MARAI Centre is such an important centre in terms of showcasing the excellence in sustainability research that we have overall. I've been in post now since last March, and one of the things that I'm trying to really advocate for within UCC is that we enhance areas of where there's true interdisciplinarity. And that's what UCC Futures is about. It's about creating hubs where people can actually work together across disciplines and across different areas. And tonight's event is a clear showcasing of how this has already been going on for quite some time within UCC, but it's great to advocate it for it even more. And often when we work across disciplines, it's about learning each other's language, and that can be the issue overall. And Metaphor, Sustainability, Transformation is really a book about language, written by, I would say, non-linguists, but it's written in a way that allows us to celebrate the wonder of language at getting stories and ideas across that can be quite complex. And also the trouble with language as well. But I think it's a great example of truly transdisciplinary research in UCC. And metaphors are really important in all aspects of what we do. We all like to be able to tell stories, and I'm sure, like many of you, I watched the movie Don't Look Up over the holiday season, which is really a metaphor for the climate crisis that we have. And while it gained a lot of attention, people were criticizing its simplistic use of metaphor, but it was a powerful metaphor in some ways in being able to communicate the importance of where we are overall. And so I think, you know, what we're trying to get across is where this can be powerful and where it can be used. And I'll conclude by stealing the words of Milan Kundera, the Czech writer who wrote in The Unbearable Likeness of Being that Tomas, the main character, did not realize at the time that metaphors are dangerous. Metaphors are not to be trifled with. A single metaphor can give birth to love. And I'm sure this book has been a labor of love for all of the authors, and I wish you all the success with this, and I hope we will see a metaphor too in the future overall. So thanks for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you very much, John. Can I now call on the Director of MARI, the Science Foundation Ireland Research Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine, Professor Brina Gallagher, just to say a few words of welcome.
Thank you very much, Ger. And just to add to the congratulations that John gave, it's great to see this book published. I had a very minor role as a co-author on one of the chapters, but I do recall with pleasure the workshop. It's interesting reflecting on that now, because it was a workshop where we could actually meet in person and exchange views, stories, narratives, metaphors that formed an initial basis for the idea for this book. In the spirit of the book and the focus, I want to tell a story very briefly. And casting my mind back to 2013, so 9 years ago now, I was invited to attend an excellent workshop by Ger, Ed and Colin, who had organized this workshop on transdisciplinary perspectives on sustainability. And really for me, that was one of the, I suppose, roots, if you like, of where this book came from. That workshop in 2013 was also in person, and subsequently we published a book of the same name arising from those discussions. And I was really challenged at that workshop in a very collegial and great way. I was coming from the science and engineering perspective, talking about climate action and the energy transition. I was really challenged in a very fruitful way by my colleagues from the social sciences in terms of, I suppose, broadening my perspective to look more at the societal dimension of the topics I was looking at. Rolling forward then 5 years to 2018, as we developed the phase 2 proposal for MARI, the Science Foundation Ireland Centre, we managed to incorporate in that some explicit references to research that we needed to do on the societal dimension. Even though SFI is under law funds science and engineering, we managed to sneak in some of the social sciences. And then around that same time, Ian Hughes joined us from the Department of then Enterprise, Trade and Employment. And Ian is the important catalyst then to, I suppose, adding on that foundation of the troika of Ger, Ed and Colin to, I suppose, result in the workshop that formed the basis for this book, but also to reach beyond the social sciences to the arts and humanities. And it was really a precursor, as John said, this is really reflected now strongly in UCC's clustering, and I commend John for what he's done there in terms of highlighting the important areas and also the interdisciplinarity and the transdisciplinarity of the research that we do. So it's an excellent book. I'm delighted to be here to join in the celebrations of it, and I'll hand back to you, Ger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'd like to call on two of the co-editors now just to say a few words, just to put the evolution of the book in context. So if I could begin with Colin Sage.
Thanks, Ger. Yes, and good afternoon to everyone from sunny Portugal, where I now live. And it's an interesting moment to reflect upon the dark days of 2011 in the aftermath of the bank bailout, when the Irish state looked like it was going to have some limitations on the ability to continue to fund university research. And I remember there was a brief glimpse of light on the horizon when the Office for the Vice President for Research and Innovation announced that, or instructed really, the colleges of the university to assemble 5 research priority areas for consideration for possible inclusion in a UCC funding proposal to the HEA. So we were all busily engaged in that exercise, and I had proposed that one of those themes would be environmental citizenship, and we took that forward. I mean, that got the nod, as it were, and And so that's when I reached out to Jer, with whom I've collaborated over a number of years. And the idea was to build this idea of environmental citizenship as a platform for collaboration, for dialogue, really, as much as anything else. And Jer had already been involved with working with Ed through other teaching initiatives and so on. So the three of us really began that process, and that led to a first conference back in 2011, September 2011, which we called Environmental Citizenship, Ecological Politics and Global Justice. I mean, just to give you a sense, there were no limits to our ambition at the time. So we were going to take over the world, but unfortunately, the kind of discourse around collaboration at that time was much more difficult, let's say. Professor Cryan has alluded now to the fact that everyone's on board to this idea of a transdisciplinary, collaborative kind of way of working, and that's to be very welcomed. But 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. And really, I think as much as anything, we really need to acknowledge the participation, the heroic participation of people like Brian O'Gallagher, who was willing to put his neck on the line and start opening up a conversation with social scientists, which I don't think necessarily all of his colleagues would have regarded as a good career move at the time. But what happened is in 2013, we then, the three of us, Jer, Ed and myself, put together this other conference. We had some great keynote speakers, Andy Sterling, John Barry, and Michael Narodslowski from Austria. And really, it sort of sucked in more people from across the college as well, and that was very, very, very good. Coming out of that, out of that meeting was our first book, the Transdisciplinary Perspectives book, which was published in 2017. I should say just finally that that term perspectives that made it to the title was a late substitute for the word conversations, because all the way through we've really been emphasizing the spirit of conversation as part of this process, and really that was where we were in 2017, finishing up that, and that's when Ian, I think, appears and really picks the baton up and provides another new kind of source of energy and idea for taking us forward. So I'll pass over to Ian to say a few words about the book.
Thanks, Colin.
Thanks very much, Colin. So hello, everyone. I'm going to say a few words just to give you an overview of the book. I think the slide is up there now that shows you the contents page, so I'll talk through that. But also I'd like to start by saying something about a couple of the ideas that underpin it, they've been alluded to a little bit already. So as Colin and others have said, language, particularly metaphor and story, shape how we see the world and how we think and act. So if this seems a bit esoteric, just think of the consequences of language that's being used to target particular groups of people as parasites, swarms and floods and marauders, pollutants. You just need to reflect on this for a few seconds to see the real world consequences of language and the metaphors that we use. So the book then is an exploration of how this is the case, the importance of language is the case when it comes to the challenges of climate change and ecological and environmental destruction. An exploration of how metaphor and story really matter. And I'd say I'm absolutely delighted that Joe Blake has joined us here today. Joe will be able to make that point much more succinctly than I ever could. In the initial discussions that Brian and Colin have talked about, among the book's authors, two things quickly became very evident, and they became the foundational ideas, if you like, for the book. First, it became evident that all of the authors shared a belief that the series of crises that we face, climate change is one, but by no means the only one. There's also the erosion of democracy, the rise of authoritarianism, increasing geopolitical tensions that we see right at the moment, and the threat of war that accompanies them, socially destabilizing levels of inequality, and as the pandemic has shown, a persistent gulf between the rich world and the majority world. So there was a belief that these crises, these cascading crises, as Joe Biden said in his inaugural address, require transformation not only in technology, but also more fundamentally in how we think and act. The second idea that became very evident among the authors in our initial discussions was a shared belief that the way forward is not preordained, but we, humanity, have to find a way forward. The future is ours to create. Because of this profound uncertainty, it's essential to have the insights from every discipline around the table. Conversations and connections across disciplines are not an option. They are the way we will need to create a future that is both workable and, crucially, ethical. So, as the introductory chapter of the book says then, the book is based on a belief that metaphors and stories we currently use can lead us to act inappropriately, as an understatement, and that an active reimagining of our language is needed. In this spirit, the book offers a wide range of metaphors to illustrate the possibilities for such a reimagining, which I will briefly outline now. So if you look at the slide there, you'll see that the book has 4 sections. Section 1 is metaphors of reason. This section focuses on metaphors of science and technology, particularly of climate change and energy and food systems. Here you will find metaphors of planetary boundaries, technological change, cyborgs freed of the need for food, carbon budgets, and metabolic rifts that we have created between ourselves and nature. Section 2 is metaphors of unreason. This section challenges the primacy of science and technology and explores right brain thinking, the complementarity duality of yin and yang, our Faustian bargain of selling our souls in return for material progress, and has a new take on the story of the tortoise and the hare. Do we really have time for slow and steady to win the race in the face of climate change? Section 3 then is metaphor, myth, and mind, which explores metaphors from psychology and psychoanalysis, of mental health and physical illness, and metaphors of dream, myths of Oedipus and Narcissus, of decline and decay, and of shape-shifting and shamanic dreams. And the final section is metaphors of creativity and practice, where we turn to literature and creative practice. Here you'll find metaphors of James Joyce's arches as portals of transformation, of Mike McCormick's solar bones, of diffraction, ambivalence, and overdetermination, and the language of music, dance, and visual art. So you will see there's a whole host of metaphor we have explored as jumping off point for rethinking the language we might use to move us toward more just and sustainable societies. Before I hand back to Jerry, I'd just like to say a quick word, as Colin had mentioned, about the process we engaged in. The meetings and discussions that informed the book happened before the pandemic, as Brian said, where we met in person as a group. And one person who attended those meetings remarked on the atmosphere that there was there. They were a place where you could feel safe to say what you didn't know, where you could be curious to learn more from others who knew more than you, and where you could offer your own knowledge, knowing that it would be heard. This spirit in which we gathered and worked together, I think, says something about how we need to think and act more generally if we are to survive the crises we face, with a combination of courage to act on what we know and humility to listen when we don't know, recognizing that ignorance is an invitation to learn. Finally, may I finish by saying it's a real pleasure that Joe Blake is joining us here today. Welcome to our virtual Ireland, Joe, and thank you for being here. Just finally, before I hand back to Jared, to say that the first chapter is open access, so you can read that, and we will put the link for that in the chat during the event. Back to you, Jared.
Thanks very much, Ian, and that's a lovely segue, I think, to the introduction of our special guest this evening. Before I introduce Joe, I just might mention to you that the chat is open and that we'll be gathering questions for the Q&A for later on this evening. So I'm delighted to be able to join the leading storyteller, Joe Blake, as our special guest. Dr. Blake has a PhD in storytelling practices, an MA with distinction in dance theatre, a BA honours in performing arts. Joe performs, she teaches and collaborates with a number of prominent national and international institutions, including the National Trust, the National Theatre, and the British Council. So Joe is going to share a story with us, and then we'll have some responses from some of the book authors. So over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Jer. And thank you to everyone who's spoken so far, and to Ian for inviting me to be part of this. It's a wonderful book, and I think it's an important book and important conversations to be had. And I really resonated with what Colin said about the spirit of conversation. And definitely when I work with a story, and when a story works with me, it feels like it's a dialogical process. the story and I are in some kind of conversation, so they're always shifting and finding new things. But as we're in the realm of metaphor and language, I just want to take a moment right at the beginning, before I start the story, to just remember that language and words come out of the environment of the body. So they are muscle, they are breath, they're bone. So just before I start, I invite you, before we go into analysis and conversation, to feel your feet on the ground and to feel your body where it sits, and especially the weight of your body. So from the moment we're born, every cell in the body is oriented towards the center of the earth. So gravity is the earth's way of saying, you belong to me. So feel the weight, feel your breath, the edges of your body where your skin is touching your clothes. And I'll start with a story, a kind of slightly truncated story, so that we've got time for discussion, that is definitely ends in a bloody and bodied place. Erysichthon was a king who had everything. He had servants, he had money, he had wives, he had land, but he wanted more. He wanted a new feasting hall where he could gather all of his people together, and he wanted it in a particular place, on the top of a hill, where he could look out in all directions, right to the very edge of the boundaries of the land that belonged to him. But there was a problem, because on the top of that hill, there was a grove of trees that were known to be sacred to Demeter, goddess of growing things, goddess of the fertile earth, goddess of the corn. And all the people of the town said, you can't cut those trees down. The naiads, the spirits, live in those trees. Demeter will know of it, and she will punish you. But Erysichthon was a king who wanted more. And so he called all the men of the town together. He told them to sharpen their axes and go to the top of the hill and to chop down the trees. But the men, they believed in the stories. They knew that those trees were alive, and they refused. And so Erysichthon, the king, said, well, if you won't do it, I'll do it myself. He sharpened his axe. He marched to the top of the hill. He swung the axe above his shoulder and he brought it down. And where blade met bark, as soon as that threshold was crossed, there was a scream, the sound of a woman in pain. And sap like blood bled through that gap. But Erysichthon didn't stop. He kept chopping. One tree fell creaking to the ground, and the shrieking of the woman in the air. He went to another tree. He swung the blade, cut the skin, the blood bled down onto the ground, one after another, until the whole grove of trees were felled. And Erysichthon stood there, and he wiped the sweat from his brow, and he looked around at the bodies of the trees laying fallen on the ground. The shrieking faded away, but not before it had reached the ears of Demeter. And when Demeter heard the sound of her naiads suffering, she wept for them the way a mother would weep for a fallen child. But then her grief mutated, and her grief became gnarly. It became anger, an anger that could only be appeased by revenge. And she had just the right one in mind. She called a servant to her. She whispered a message into her servant's ear, and she sent her out to give that message. And that messenger had to travel far from the fertile earth, far from all that was green and growing, far from the corn, far from the luscious things, to a barren place where nothing grew. A howling wind, rocks and stones. And in that place, perched on a rock, there was hunger. She was grey and bent and old, hollow-bellied and foul-breathed, her eyes sunken. She barely had the strength to lift her head to look at the messenger who had come to her. The messenger whispered the message from Demeter to her and quickly fled, already feeling the hunger seeping into her own body. And Hunger, the wraith, followed Demeter's words. That night, as Erysichthon was sleeping in his bed, Hunger flew through his window and landed lightly upon his chest. Her lank hair brushing against his chest, his mouth was open, he was snoring. She bent down and she pressed her thin, wrinkled lips to his, and she blew. And into his body, she breathed hunger. She was gone. But Erysichthon's jaw started chewing. And in his dreams, he began to imagine eating roasted chicken. His mouth began to salivate, and he woke up. And all he could think about was the fresh bread that his cooks would be cooking in the kitchen, and the thick butter that would be spread upon them, and the way it would melt. He got out of bed, he went to the kitchens. There were the cooks already working, and he demanded food. He sat down at the table, and the food was brought to him. He ate plateful after plateful, but it was a strange thing. The more he ate, the hungrier he got. It went on like this for day after day. The cooks cooking, Erysichthon eating. Day passed and night passed. The cooks were sweating and exhausted, and the food on the shelves was diminishing. And so Erysichthon would send them into the market to fetch more. And so they would cook and he would eat. They would go to the market and buy food, and the coffers, his money started to get lower and lower and lower until the coffers were empty. He had to dismiss cooks until there was only one. He started selling furniture to buy the food that he would eat, until eventually that last cook fled. And there was only his daughter, Mestra, who was left. The gold was gone. The furniture was sold. The house was sold. The land was sold, until eventually Erysichthon, the king, had become a pauper, living in a shack with his daughter Mestra, who every day would cook and feed her father's insatiable hunger. One day Mestra was walking down by the sea. So exhausted and so pitiful was she that she fell to her knees, and she felt the foam of the ocean lap against her knees, and she cried out to Poseidon, "Please help me." And Poseidon heard her plea, and he felt the heart that was in her plea. And because no god can undo the other god's workings, all he could do was meet Demeter's curse. And so he gave Mestra the gift of shapeshifting. So now, every day, Erysichthon would take his daughter to the marketplace. She would shapeshift into the guise of a beautiful young woman looking for a husband, and he would sell her to the first buyer. He would take the money, buy his food, go back to the shack, and as soon as she could, Mestra would shapeshift back into her person, or sometimes an animal, and flee back to the shack where she would cook the food for her father. It was still no life, but somehow it was better than it had been, but the days were endless. Every day the same. Every day the going to the market, every day the cooking, and every day Erysichthon eating. Until one day, Mestra dawdled coming home. She was taking too long, she couldn't face it. But there was Erysichthon waiting for his food, his jaw chomping. And so fierce was the chomping of his jaw that he raised his hands to clamp his jaw, and as he did so, his fingertip caught between his teeth, and he ate. There was the warmth of the blood, the softness of the flesh, and the chew of the skin, and then the crunch of the bone and the nail. and Erisichthon started to eat, one finger and then another. And so he continued. And when Mestra came back, she opened her door, and that's where she found him, Erisichthon, hungry no more, having devoured everything he could, including himself. And Mestra walked away, closed the door behind her, went up to the top of that hill where that sacred grove had been cut down. She laid a wreath of flowers and walked away, free from her father's curse. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe. I'd like to call on two of the authors of the book to introduce themselves first of all, and then briefly discuss the significance of Joe's story. Could I start with Kieran Keohane?
Thank you, Ger and colleagues. And my God, that's a hard act to follow. But that was just wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Let me see if I can riff off it a little bit and see if I can also speak to the theme of metaphor and so on, and maybe what we're missing. And maybe I'll begin by saying it's appropriate to have such a bloody story as you in Job. Says
Kieran, your screen has frozen.
So even playing out at the level of the human subject, you know, the transformation of personality. Hear me still? Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
And did you lose much of what I said?
Yeah, it's coming and going. What I might do, Kieran, is that if you want to log out and log in again, what I might do is I might move over and ask Jules to come in.
Okay, I'm going to drop out then.
Hello there. I'm Jules Gilson. I'm Professor of Creative Practice at UCC, and I'm actually on a writing retreat by the Blackwater, so I'm just going to show you where I am, you can see. And I think that's relevant to what we're talking about in terms of environment and sustainability. Thank you, Joe, for a beautiful story. I was struck particularly by how you started with embodiment. And is it okay that I'm not on the main screen, or am I on the main screen?
Yes, you're on the main screen.
Oh, okay,
Thanks,
that's fine. That's fine. Just wanted people to be able to see me. Because I feel like that part of creative and artistic practice is so critical. And I've been lucky enough to have some time away from Ireland. Well, not lucky in the sense that I wanted to get away from Ireland, but it was a bit miraculous that I was able to go to Colorado and work on projects as a Fulbright scholar for the last 4 months. And a lot of that work was involved with at the beginning of your story, Joe, there, where you ask people to kind of feel the weight of their body and to kind of have a sense of that connection, really stayed with me in terms of the process of listening to stories. And it feels like it's such an old practice, storytelling. Many of us, if we're lucky enough to have been parents, we would have spoken stories to our children. So that kind of process of connection with the telling of stories, and not just written down stories, but the utterance of stories and the process by which you tell us that story, feels really resonant and important. In my time away just now, and so it's kind of fresh in my body and in my mind, I was working on the Irish peatland bogs as theme and a metaphor, and I was using embodiment and choreographic practice as a methodology, as a way to inquire into story, and I was particularly working with 2 dance artists, and we were exploring the sensibility and the qualities of boggish soil. And I'm very aware that in a context of kind of a range of disciplines as we have here, that that might feel like a very strange methodology, but I'm so assured that it's such a kind of concrete way into thinking by having had the opportunity to kind of work in that way. And so I suppose it's my response to your story, Joe, is not so much about the content of the story, but about the utter importance of remembering our embodiment in all of our contexts, and that the very skilled and beautiful way of you telling your story is a very embodied skill, and that you do that with incredible assuredness about the story, but also an ability to modulate how you to do it as a song that enchants us, and that those explorations of this story about greed and environment resonates in us as an embodied thing. And I'm really interested in the ways in which we can use embodied learning in our research and in our education, and in the research that I'm really excited to be coming back to UCC to be a part of. So I hope that's helpful as a kind of provocation, and perhaps we could open it up to, after we go to my colleague, we could open that up for further discussion.
Thanks very much, Jules. Kieran, I'm going to check back in with you and see if the sound is okay. You're on mute at the moment.
Okay, how's that?
That's fine.
Is that better? Okay,
yeah.
Great. Okay, sorry about the interruption, folks. Hopefully this connection will be more stable. Joe, I really like.
Okay, apologies, folks. We appear to be having problems.
What I was going to say, what we say was a core evident. No. Gosh.
Could you maybe just do audio, not video? Might that help?
Yeah.
Well, it's okay. How about?
It's still buffering.
Can you hear me okay? I'm really sorry, because my internet connection here is usually really good, and I don't. Otherwise, will I drop out and try it one more time?
Yeah, I mean, in the meantime, if anybody would like to make observations in the chat, then we could perhaps put those observations to Joe or to Jules. So hopefully we'll be able to reconnect with Kieran. If not, we'll simply move on to the next part of the segment. So I maybe call on Ian if he'd like to maybe make a brief response.
Thanks, Chair. I guess for me, the story resonates so much with a lot of what we were talking about when we were writing the book, but also in terms of further conversations about, you know, our current society, the values. I said a little bit in the introductory remarks that the transition to sustainability is much more than a transition in technology. It's a transition in values and beliefs and that underpin our society. Yeah? And so the idea of, you know, cutting down the sacred trees, I think this is something that Kieran was very close to Kieran's heart in terms of our current society as being one where we live beyond limits. You know, we cut down the sacred. There are no limits in what we do, and our greed is set free. And the consequences of that are everywhere around us to be seen. So I think it's the story that you told, Joe, was a very powerful metaphor and resonates very much with sort of the underpinnings of the project, the broader project that we're working on about reimagining our society, and the need for limits, the need for values that can constrain the worst in human nature.
Thanks very much, Ian. Katrina Needul asks Jo, what's the most challenging thing about telling such a story?
Well, you know, it's funny when I was talking to Ian on the phone the other day about what stories to tell for this. What I was looking for were two different stories that had very different metaphors or imaged the human relationship with nature in a very different way. And this one is part of what I would imagine to be a kind of group of stories to do with the fall or the separation. It's kind of moments in time where the human and the non-human or the more than human have kind of severed in some way. And in this one, in a very violent way, kind of very violent severing of that connection. It's imaged in a very violent way. So I guess what's most difficult about it is yeah, I don't know what's difficult about it. I feel like it can be quite shocking to the senses, having something that kind of physically uncomfortable, perhaps the images in the mind that it kind of conjures or asks us to look at closely. But I don't find the telling of it particularly difficult. But I think what can happen with a story is that they become a bit of a companion. So you can kind of in a way hang out with the story for quite a long time before you tell it. And if it's a story that has this kind of violence in it, then it means you're kind of in the atmosphere of that. You're kind of steeping in the atmosphere of that for some time, which can be quite uncomfortable, you know. So, and this one not so bad because it's short, and I can kind of keep it over here and then pick it up when I want to. But if I was making a whole performance about that story, it would mean that I've got to somehow energetically and physically engage with those images on a regular basis. That's when it can become challenging and uncomfortable. And you kind of have to have ways of stepping out of it and leaving it behind. So that's what I would find challenging about that. And actually that story did become a bigger performance that I made with a group of third year students in Northampton University 2 years ago, just before COVID hit. And they wanted to make a piece that was about climate. And that was the story that we used as the kind of basis on which to then explore our relationship with the natural world, the other than human world. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Jo. Kieran, perhaps we'll try one more time, and if not, we'll move on to the second story.
Okay, hopefully that will be a little bit better. Okay, so what I was going to say, Jo, is, you know, I love that. It was really great, and it raises the Walter Benjamin says someplace, I think is an essay. So
Kieran, I'm afraid the gods are against us this evening. We might try maybe after the second story again.
No problem, Joe. Sorry about that.
In the absence of any observations, perhaps we might invite Jo to begin the second story this evening.
You know, I was thinking about this, the thing of the transdisciplinary, like the crossing of boundaries. You know, clearly the gods that we should be making an offering to for today would be Hermes in the Greek pantheon. You know, the god of the crossroads, the god of the meeting places, and also I think god of technology and communication. So maybe we didn't make our offerings for tonight. So the second story that I want to tell is from a very, very different family of stories, a kind of different branch of stories. So the last story was obviously Greek. So it's from the kind of the civilized world, if you like, civilization. And but this next story comes from an indigenous family of stories in Native America. where there's always a tension in me about diving into this material for all the obvious reasons, colonialism and the appropriation, issues around appropriation. But the reason why I wanted to tell it is because it images the relationship between humans and the more than human in a very different way. And so I wanted to bring in that other relationship and the kind of different atmosphere into the conversation. So again, the invitation is to be in your body. And stories don't, there was a saying, I forget who said it, that the written word goes from the eye to the brain, but the spoken word goes from the ear to the heart. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily that dichotomy, but there's something in that. So feeling your weight, feeling your breath, and just allowing yourself to listen. There was once a girl, and she was sick. She was sick with a pain in her chest. She was sick with a rattling cough, so that it hurt her to talk, it hurt her to laugh, it hurt her even to breathe. And her mother and father were so worried that they sat by her side day and night, lighting the fire in the center of the teepee, wrapping her in blankets. But the girl did not get better. Eventually, the mother looked at the father and she said, "Fetch duck egg. She'll know what to do." And so the father strapped on his snowshoes. A thick layer of skins he wrapped around his body, lifted the door flap, out into the night he went. And sometime later, the door flap lifted and an old woman rolled in, old like a boulder of stone. Long grey hair, wrinkles on her face, and bright, shining eyes. Duckegg got down on her knees beside the girl who lay beside the fire. And she warmed her hands from the cold. And then Duckegg placed her hands upon the contours of the girl's face, and she felt the softness of the collarbone and the dip. She felt the heat in the chest, and she pressed her hands onto the girl's chest. And then Duckegg bent right down and she pressed her ear to the girl's chest and she listened. And for a very, very long time, she listened. And eventually she sat up and she said, "The sound I hear in the girl's chest is the sound of a she-fox. She is hurt. She is limping. Every now and then her back leg cracks through the hard crust of snow. Ka-cha, ka-cha, ka-cha. This is the sound I hear in the girl's chest." The father looked at Duckegg. He said, "I am a hunter. I can find the vixen. I will bring her to you." "Yes," said Duckegg. "Find the she-fox. Bring her to me." So once again, the father wrapped himself up. He made his way out into the night, and he trudged for a long time. The daylight came in that white world of snow. And then he caught a glimpse of her, the fox. A white animal among the white snow. Most of us would not have seen her, but he did. He noticed her. And then he noticed the tracks that were leading on her journey. Back in the teepee, Duckegg pressed her ear towards the girl's chest. She said, "The hunter is drawing near. I can hear his snowshoes. Slip-cha, slip-cha, slip-cha." And so all day the hunter tracked the fox. She stayed just ahead of him until it was almost dark. And he wasn't far behind her. He could see her. But she was so weak and he was so tired, and now the light was going. He stopped. He took off his mittens and he lit a fire. He knew that the fox would not go far. She was too weak, too injured. And so he sat by the fire and he warmed his hands and he dozed all night long as the fire crackled in the darkness. And just beyond the light of the fire, there was the fox, also resting. Back in the teepee, Duck Egg put her hand upon the girl's forehead and she said, "The girl will have a fever tonight." And so she did. All night, the fever raged in her body. A heat pushed forth sweat, writhed this way and that, as if she was trying to wring herself free from the heat of the fire. And all night, Duck Egg sat one side and the mother sat the other, and they sang their songs and they burnt the sweet grasses until the morning came. And the hunter threw snow onto the fire. It hissed and died away. And he barely had to walk far before he found the fox, too weak to run. He picked it up gently and he held it close to him as if it was a baby. He could feel the fox's heart beating against the palm of his hands. He could hear in the rhythm of the beat of the fox's heart the fear that she was feeling. And so he started to sing, "Oh, na, 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 shh," the way a mother sings to a baby. And he carried the fox close to him, retracing his footsteps back to the teepee, where the door flap lifted and he walked in and he placed the vixen down onto the ground. And Duck Egg looked and she said, "She is hungry. Fetch her meat." And so dried meat was taken from the stores and the vixen ate hungrily. And when she had eaten, Duck Egg said, "Fetch more." And so more was brought and the she-fox ate. The girl's fever was subsiding. And so the fire burnt between them. And on one side, the girl slept. And on the other side, the fox slept. And Duck Egg sat between the two of them. And when the fox was in a deep sleep, Duck Egg came to it and splintered its back leg and bandaged it. And who knows for how long they slept? A long time and a short time. Until eventually, the fox opened its eyes. And it was a wild thing. Not a thing of teepees, not a thing for the inside. And so it stood up immediately, tried to put weight onto its back leg, and it winced, but it tried again and again, until the fox started to pad in a circle all the way around the teepee. And as it started to circle around them, the girl sat up. She leant against Duck Egg. The fever was still clinging to her, the remnants of it, as she looked up at Duck Egg's face. And to her eyes, Duck Egg's face looked like the whole world. Deep pits for eyes, a cavern of a mouth, a mountain of a nose, the pathways shifting and forming. The girl rubbed her eyes and she said, "I need air." "Good," said Duck Egg. "Lift the door flap. Let the fox go." And so the door flap was lifted. The fox paused for a moment at the threshold and then ran. And you could hear its feet padding out across the snow. The door flap fell down, and even as it did so, the girl could still hear in her mind the sound of the fox running. The girl sat up, breathed deeply, drank water. The fever had gone. Her chest was clearer. And Duck Egg looked at the mother of that girl and she said, "This world is full of mysteries. Tell me, who cured who? Did the girl cure the fox, or did the fox cure the girl?" And the mother took Duck Egg's hands and she said, "This world is full of mysteries. But Duck Egg, you heard the fox in the girl's chest. You remembered the connection between the two. You cured them both." And Duck Egg laughed then. And even without the haze of her fever, the girl looked up and she was sure on that old woman's face, she could see all the pathways of the world shifting and forming.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. So I'd like to hand over to Fionn Rogan to respond. Fionn, if you could just introduce who you are and then perhaps respond directly to Joe.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Joe, for that really riveting story, and as Kieran said, how to follow that. I'd love to follow it with another story from you, but I'll introduce myself. Yeah, I'm a senior research fellow in UCC in the Marai Centre and the Environmental Research Institute. I have an engineering background, and a bit like Brian, I came into this kind of group of people from a kind of an engineering and science background, but was welcomed into the kind of the transdisciplinary group. Transdisciplinary trespassing is what I began to think of the activities that we did. And I wrote a chapter on metaphors of technological change in the book, and it's a great opportunity for me to broaden my perspectives by reading a lot of history, a lot of social science, a lot of philosophy of technology, reading about metaphors, and yeah, it was I got a different perspective, and yeah, we're kind of reflecting on the story that Joe just told. Yeah, we were primed at the start to think of our bodies, and I think that helped to us, for me anyway, to attend to the sensory aspects of the story. That there was a sequence of events, there was a cause and effect and twists and turns, but there was also the cold of the snow, the kind of the warmth of the teepee, the warmth of the fever, and those aspects are central to a story, or certainly they were contributed to the engrossing nature of your story, and that perspective is something that I reflected on quite a lot when I was authoring that chapter, and the perspective of engineers is we often take a kind of a bird's eye view of the world, and we look at systems and how everything fits together, but the worm's eye view of the world, how it's experienced, is something that's as important, and it's being discussed more and more. The lived experience is kind of a phrase that's often used to kind of capture some of those perspectives, and they're as valuable. I've learned to appreciate those more and more in the way stories are told. Just a couple of other random responses, really. The teepee, I found my mind kind of dwelling on that a little bit, on the experience last summer of staying in a tent, and the way a tent, I think a bit like a teepee, it's a very porous place to be. That it's not like our modern homes that are well sealed for energy efficiency. That's great, but we're just less. We've kind of hard barriers between us and the world. But the teepee and the kind of porousness of that boundary, and the way the characters in the stories are open to different elements, and particularly the way the fox is an active participant in the story. And I love that sense of the stories aren't just about humans, that there are other. The fox is in the story as well, and that kind of sense of a broader empathy with the living world, that it's not just humans that can empathize, it's animals too, and that the concept of a broader empathy, I think, can open us up a lot to when we're thinking about grand challenges, and how we frame them and how we address them, and often how we frame them can rule in or rule out a lot of things, and a kind of a narrow framing of grand challenges. For example, a kind of a technology fix. We just need the right technologies to fix the problem. Kind of a perspective I'm familiar with as an engineer, and was the limiting perspective of that, because it kind of rules out a lot of other stakeholders, other perspectives that I've appreciated, the kind of the arts and the humanities bring in. Yeah, those are that's a kind of stream of business response. to your story. And yeah, I'll pause there.
Thanks very much, Fionn. I just note that Paul in the chat mentions that the telling of the story can be as powerful as the story itself. And maybe I'll abuse my role in the chair, maybe just to develop or to ask a little bit about one of the points that Fionn alluded to there towards the end of his intervention, the question of empathy, the need for stories that can cultivate an empathy, not just with one another, but with the wider world. And maybe just to ask Joe, and to connect back to something that John Crine said at the outset, on the one hand, stories could cultivate empathy, but on the other hand, stories can be dangerous as well. So how do we deal with that in a world now that's mediated by digital networks and social media?
Yeah, how do we mediate that? I mean, stories are dangerous. I think it's Arthur Frank has got a book, Letting Stories Breathe, where he looks at the trouble that stories cause, like what kind of trouble it is that they're trying to make somehow in the world. And there's kind of good trouble. There's like the trouble that Trickster causes, which is the kind of the trouble we need to dissolve old systems before new ones can be born. But of course, stories can become traps, absolutely. And I also picked up on what Fionn was saying about empathy, and was thinking about the act of telling, that there's something so different in sharing the same time, and not necessarily space, but we're sharing the same time as each other right now. So we're not receiving something and kind of picking up a book and taking it away on our own. There's something collective that we're experiencing together. And I think that in and of itself can create an environment of empathy, an environment of sharing somehow. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how you kind of guard against the danger of stories, but one thing I guess that I do feel is how our bodies respond to stories. So quite often when I work with a story, when I hear a story, there'll be some kind of felt sense in me. There'll be some kind of bodily experience. It might be a tightening, or it might be a relaxation, or it might leave me with a kind of lingering feeling afterwards. And I think those sensations, those feelings are really telling about the quality or of the content of the story that we're being told. What feeling am I left with when I walk away? And is it a kind of leaning in towards that story, or is there a kind of leaning back and leaning back away from it? So I think learning to kind of listen to those responses that may not be rational, so they kind of may be below rational understanding, might not rationally understand why I lean towards a certain story or lean away from it, but whether there is a pull towards or a push away can be really telling about whether that story is good for us or not. And that's kind of, I guess, a thought about that. But one thing, I guess that I do know is, stories are intensely powerful, and so there's always that need to be aware of what we're ingesting and where we're getting our stories from, I suppose. Yeah. Well, you're on mute, Jer, still.
I'm beginning to think that's my second name. You're on mute. So Ed, you've typed something into the chat there, and I think it's particularly appropriate. Would you like maybe to make that intervention?
Yeah, Jerry, I suppose it's something that's on all our minds at the moment and has been for the last week. We've been profoundly challenged in this country, and there's been conversations going on an ongoing basis. I know, Jerry, you've been touched personally by, but a week ago this afternoon, a girl went out for a run and didn't come home. And there's a new story emerging there's a new story emerging in the wake of that about how we, not just about murders and so on and that, but how we interact with each other in particular with women and in the public spaces, and people should be safe to walk around, to run, to do the normal things in the public sphere. And I think that just, that there's been a huge movement in that very short period of time, and it just really, to me, shows how powerfully resonant stories can be. And facts don't cause transformational change. We have the likes of Brian has been engaging with and colleagues in Marai with a government for how we can actually change, get on track for societal change that's required to 2030, 2050 and beyond. But it's stories, it's personal stories like this that cause change. So I think maybe there's some parallels in terms of how change manifests, and it's just I think just certainly this afternoon as well. It's a week since that awful thing happened.
Thanks, Ed. There's another interesting observation in the chat. I'm reading it as Arnie. And Arnie says, the story brings to mind how Indigenous knowledge systems have managed environmental sustainability prior to colonial expropriation and extraction. How can we bring these epistemological and storytelling systems to the current climate crisis and inequality, economic, racial, gender, and so on? Joe, would you like to respond to that?
Well, one thing I would recommend is that everyone reads a book called Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta, who's an Australian Aboriginal academic who is writing about Indigenous knowledge systems and looking at kind of Western knowledge systems through the lens of the Indigenous, and is discussing that exactly where this meeting place is between these different knowledge systems, because you're right that the Indigenous communities that still exist have a level of sustainability that's kind of almost unimaginable to us now in terms of the depth of time that those systems have passed on through, even with the disruption and interruption that European culture has caused worldwide. So I think difficult conversations had to be had around the effects of colonialism and appropriation, and also I think there has to be a lot of space for grief. I mean, Ed just brought up something that was clearly there's some kind of grief that is also there that needs to be felt, and I think whenever we're exploring working or the interface between kind of Western systems and Indigenous ways of knowing, it will bring up difficulties and it will bring up grief. And so I think there needs to be some kind of allowance for that and a way of negotiating that for conversations to be had. Because really, I think that there is, the Indigenous cultures harbour the knowledge that I think is really what we need for going forward. And it's not about going back. So it's about somehow bringing that forward. And I think one thing that's really important when engaging with Indigenous knowledge systems is trying to kind of work away from this idea that there's been one linear trajectory in humanity. We were hunter-gatherers that then became farmers, that then became technologized, into the cityscapes and where we are now. But actually one group of humans has had that trajectory. But even to this day, there are other groups of humans that have never gone on that trajectory, that have kind of in a much more cyclical relationship to time and place, and whose trajectory has been much more like this as opposed to like that. So I think we need to open up those conversations, which will be quite difficult, I suppose. But I think there is all of that knowledge there as a resource for moving forward with,
I think that observation on grief is important, and it evokes another idea, the idea of loss. We've seen in reports over the last week or so that biodiversity and extinction is under greater threat than ever. And that idea now of the sixth great extinction is, while it was a popular trope for quite a long time, the scientific evidence is beginning to build up behind it. So grief and loss, I think, are important motivators. Frank says there, could someone comment on the stories we live without realizing they're stories? The story of progress, for example, or the story of technological mastery. Now, equally, Fionn, given that that was one of the themes of your chapter, would you like to maybe respond to that?
Thanks, yeah. Great question. Yeah, I'll just get a prop here to support me. So one of the books that I read during my kind of awakening as writing this chapter was Does Technology Drive History? And it's a kind of an edited collection from a number of decades ago by some, and the subtitle is The Dilemma of Technological Determinism. And it's about this idea that technology drives history, and yeah, technology influences all change, and humans should just really accept this and kind of go along with it. And progress can often be kind of really framed in the same way, that it's an unstoppable train, and you either get on or lose out. And I suppose deconstructing that story is very important, and seeing that technology determinism is often a way of ruling people out or foreclosing options, and it's it's kind of a power grab in a sense. So that the story of technological mastery is it's a power story, and one of the comments I wanted to add about stories, and it was a quote from Philip Roth, the novelist, and he talked about writing historical fiction and stories from the past, telling different stories about how the world could have been different, and his aim was to defatalize the past, and to show how what happened in the past was not inevitable, even though we're so familiar with it. It seems like it was inevitable, and that, I think, there's a liberation in that sense, that there's nothing inevitable about what happens next. Despite what the technological determinists might say, that technology is driving history. People drive history, or in our hands. So yeah, the destructive nature of stories can come from who's telling them, and what's the real motivation behind the story that's being told. Yeah, thanks. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Fionn. So in keeping with the spirit of the evening, part of our story here is a spirit of resilience. And in that vein, Kieran is going to attempt to intervene one more time. Kieran, over to you. Your microphone is off, Kieran, I think.
Could I just pick up actually on which?
Okay, go ahead.
I wanted to pick up on your idea of
No, I'm afraid it isn't working, Kieran. Kieran, would you maybe chat and or type an observation into the chat, and we could relate directly?
That's going to take too long, Chair. That's not going to work, I think.
Okay. So Marcus Glatz, would you like to, you've typed quite a long observation into the chat. Would you like to intervene? Could we facilitate Marcus, please?
Marcus should be able to talk there now.
Oh yeah, hi, can you hear me now?
Perfect, yeah.
Oh, brilliant, thanks a lot. This is a surprise that you can beam me in there, but I mainly want to express what a great evening and what a great impression I get now through this evening, because I tried to wrote it to express it in some few words. I came in with the conviction that it's mainly a reflective capacity that helps me to change the frames I had been brought up with, you know, by learning my language, by finding my position in society and things. That reflection helps me to change the destructive ways of being shaped by society. But I really gained a lot by the approach that I saw and found the testimonial this tonight. You know, this embodying aspect of good stories, of vital stories, of stories with a specific wiseness, as Joe brought it along. So this embodying aspect to me became very important, as well as something that I sometimes forget, working as a scientist, this aspect of empathy, you know. And I'm really convinced, again, at the end of this evening, that this empathy fundament is really vital. Before I reflect things, you know, it is my attitude, how I approach the world and others and animals and whatever. So empathy, embodiment, and reflection seem to me the sources, after this evening, how I can positively shape and find good metaphors, good frames for sustainability or towards sustainability. I hope that helps. You brought me in, Jer. Thanks a lot. I tried it here from Austria with my German mother tongue, but I hope I could bring in one or two thoughts. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. And Marcus's observations are also in the chat there as well. A very practical question. One of my colleagues might put a link to Routledge's website in relation to the book. But I'd like to move along and again remind you that there will be a little bit of time for discussion in a few moments. But it's a pleasure now to call on Katrina Nydul. Katrina is a professor in German at the School of Languages, Literatures and Cultures here in UCC. And also works in the sphere of kind of eco-humanities. So if I could call on Katrina, maybe just to offer some reflections on the evening.
Thanks, Ger, and hello everybody. Can you hear me okay? I hope Hermes is with us by the loch tonight. So it's just wonderful to be at this event. It's so exciting to see this book launched. I haven't been at UCC very long. I arrived 8 weeks before the pandemic. And one of the first pieces of work I discovered published by colleagues in UCC outside of my own department and indeed college, and I discovered it with great pleasure and interest, was the volume Transdisciplinary Perspectives on Transitions to Sustainability. And I'd like to congratulate Ger, Ed, Colin and Ian on this follow-up volume. I think this will be demonstrates the continuation of this very important transdisciplinary work and showcases also really important thought-provoking work from across different disciplines. And that's just wonderful to see. It's one of the things that's really encouraging us as well in our nascent venture of the eco-humanities, which is coming out of CACS. And I think there are several affiliated with the eco-humanities group whose work is also in this new volume. So it's really great to see these initiatives. I'll just offer some thoughts on Faust. I'm professor in German and I'm actually teaching Faust to undergraduates at the moment. So I was really delighted to see Faust was name checked 14 times in this volume. And it's usually in connection with the Faustian bargain, which is really used very powerfully as one of the stories that we can tell ourselves about the trouble, using Donna Haraway's term of the trouble that we're in, the trouble we need to stay with. That in a way there's been a selling of a soul of some kind to gain knowledge that then turns out to be dangerous knowledge. So this is a powerful myth with which we can frame the experience of the Anthropocene. But Faust doesn't just sell his soul for knowledge, he also wants intensity of embodied experience, which is what he gets with Gretchen. And the other thing he wants is to slow down. So the key part of his wager with the devil is that he says, if I could say to this moment, stay, you are so beautiful. And of course, if the devil fails to deliver up that particular moment of suspended delight and animation and ecstasy, then he will have lost his deal. So it's always tricky with Goethe's Faust to kind of disentangle the ways in which he has sort of brought that much older myth into modernity. And I think the story of Gretchen as well is the one that reminds us of what Ed just so poignantly referred to there as well, but what was already present in both of Joe's stories. The daughter, Mestra, has to serve the devouring father, who ends up then, because he begins by devouring the other, ends up by devouring himself. And in the other story, it's a very different kind of father who places his abilities at the service of the healing older woman. I think it's very interesting in these myths to see how gender questions play out. And I think that Faust is a very good place to start with this. There is, of course, the Faustian bargain, but there are many subplots and other energies in that play as well, which it's always wonderful to rediscover. This slowness as well, if I could just stay with you, beautiful moment, the desire to just slow down is key to Mestra's escape from the devouring father. It is in the moment of dawdling on her return from the marketplace that story takes its important turning point that will lead ultimately to her escape from her imprisonment. The dawdling, I was really struck in Joe's performance of the story with this dawdling, with the slowness that we now require in the age of the great acceleration in which we seem to be hurtling on a violent self-devouring trajectory. It is moments of slowness where we come back to ourselves, come back to our bodies, that we can disentangle and decouple ourselves from that. So I really wanted to thank Jo also, not just for her powerful embodied delivery in the virtual space of these stories, but for reminding us of the healing potential that can come once we sit and listen and really confront the prospect of devouring the other, becoming self-devouring. Finally, as a linguist, I wanted to say a word about metaphor, because I think this volume opens up wonderful new perspectives on metaphor, and to remind us that in the theory of metaphor, and you touch, I notice in your introductions, particularly on Lakoff and Johnson, and that brought me back to theories of metaphor, which in the languages we talk to our students about a lot. And we talk about the relationship between the vehicle and the tenor. That's sort of one of the key pieces of terminology we use. But the vehicle then in the metaphor of spaceship Earth, we see the Earth as a spaceship, and we use that spaceship in a sense as a vehicle, and the Earth becomes a tenor for that metaphor. And of course, that's quite a technocratic metaphor, as you point out in your introduction. But there's another way too of seeing how metaphors carry one thing over into another realm. And if I can translate from the German, we can talk about the benefactor and the recipient. And I think that's another way of framing metaphor that can be very helpful in German. It's the Bildspender and the Bildempfänger-Ebene. So what metaphors are is also a gift. It's a gift to perception, a gift to cognition, and it's a way of opening something up. Metaphor, as you also point out in your introduction, involves a carrying over. And maybe now is the point at which we begin to ask, also with reference to those indigenous epistemologies which came up just now, what is it that we want to carry over from the time before? We are now moving into this post-Holocene, a very violent and destructive history of colonial industrial modernity, and yet there will be things that we will want to carry over from the time before. As Jo so powerfully put it just now, it's not about going back. So how do we move forward? And I think this volume contributes really strongly to helping us to frame these questions together across our disciplinary boundaries. So thank you all so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you very much for that, Katrina. And again, almost seamlessly, you've segued into, and Kieran is back. He's not giving up. He has posted an observation into the chat, which I'll read out. So Kieran wanted to say something about the power of ancient stories to awaken imagination. The key story, the meta-narrative of enlightenment and modernity, is linear time as progress, but that's only one story about time. Time is recurrence. Plato, Wittgenstein, Nietzsche, and his favorite Vico, who says imagination is the resurfacing and reworking of recollections. Imagination is memory, and it's the power of imagination that's preserved and reproduced in myths and stories. Stefan in Austria observes that emotions really hit an important point and can be related to personal memories and a strong link for deep common understanding. And it's important also to relate it to context. Cormac points out that he was struck by the first story, especially the metaphors of consumption, and that it evoked feelings of empathy towards the daughter who had to shapeshift only to reach a stalemate between the gods and herself and become a commodity. The challenge for sustainability is finding solutions that requires radical shifting. For example, the way I consume, but does not reach a stalemate. So we've reached a point where we have some time for discussion and questions or interventions. So again, if you'd like to make an observation, could you maybe just type into the chat? Or if some of my colleagues here, if I can see the hands up function, if you just point out to me if anybody wants to intervene. So perhaps while we're waiting for that to happen, could I go back maybe to Ian just for his reflections?
Thanks, Chair. I think Joe's storytelling is so powerful. Right? It's very emotional. It really strikes. And so thank you, Joe, first of all, for being here and for the stories that you've told. There's so much that we could talk about. We're only scratching the surface. I think in terms of, if we had another hour, I think we could talk about the kinds of stories, for example, from my own personal experience, the stories in science, my own background in physics and then in psychoanalysis. They tell very different stories. Huh? The story in science is one I remember as a teenager of, discovering that the stars were all like the sun. We lived in this vast cosmos. It was a story of wonder, but it was also a story of uncare. It's selfish genes and survival of the fittest. And the universe doesn't care about us. It's this, which also paints a picture of us separate from nature. The universe doesn't care about us, as if we are separate from it. The story in psychoanalysis I think is very different. The story in psychoanalysis is basically, we need love. And if we don't get love, it comes back and it boomerangs back on us in terms of what happens within society. Yeah? And to Kieran's point also about, our development isn't a linear process, it's about recurrences. We can shift back into infantile mindsets that have us at one another's throats in an instant. So I said that there's lots, as I say, we're scratching the surface, and I thank you again, Joe, for this. I think we'll have to have you back and have a longer period when we can start to go below the surface a bit more.
Thanks, Ian. Could I ask Tara perhaps to pop the address of the Mare website into the chat for people that are interested in following up, or indeed the accessing the recording after the meeting. Perhaps if I could go to Colin very briefly, if he has any concluding thoughts.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I do. Thank you for the invitation to just say a few more words, because clearly we all tend to come back to our kind of landing place, the things that we know best. In my respect, in my case, it's thinking this through the lens of food. And I suppose when I think about food in relation to the language and the ideas that have come up this afternoon, it's to think about how deeply commoditized our relationship to our essential, requirements for human survival have become. and the degree to which it's going to require an enormous struggle to recover the languages or the language and the terminology associated with commonality, a sense of the commons, a sense of conviviality, of mutualism, and how we recover, a sense of food becoming a means by which we can enjoy commensality. All of these are non-commodified ways of relating to each other and to sustenance, to support our bodies. And in the language that is used around food, of course, most conspicuously by our government, or the Irish government, and its promotion of beef and dairy production, the language is entirely linked up with economics and production and growth and so on and so forth. So we've started with what we've done so far, but we've got such a job of work to do to recover and liberate really important words and begin to re-embed them back into our everyday life.
Thanks very much, Colin. We're drawing pretty close to our time limit. If anybody would like to intervene, I just see a comment there from Ivan. As we respond to the ecological crisis, how might we conjure in story and metaphor a sense of urgency and crisis with a sense of possibility and hope? That's a big question, Ivan. Does anybody want to try and take that one?
Can I just briefly jump in here as someone who's worked on one of the foremost philosophers of hope, Ernst Bloch, who talks about militant hope and who rethinks utopia as a process rather than a place, and as a sort of impulse and orientation rather than something we could ever have a definitive blueprint for. What I found very helpful in my own work on this, and I've begun to talk to other colleagues in UCC about it, is the idea of active hope, which comes out of the work that Reconnects, developed by Joanna Macy. And it is somewhat oblique to academic research. It's a way of getting in touch with emotions around these issues, but the idea of hope as process, rather than a blind technoscientific optimism, hope as a kind of practice, as almost a spiritual discipline, can be developed through these sorts of dialogues. I see Colin nodding, and I think there is some familiarity with these ideas. And together with Aoife Corcoran in the ERI, we're thinking about maybe putting something together at UCC for anyone who would be interested in exploring active hope with us further.
Okay, I think active hope is probably a wonderful way to conclude our discussions in many ways. I think to go any further might be to deconstruct that hope in a certain kind of a way. So it really comes down to me to thank all of our speakers, especially to Jo for her wonderful stories, and indeed Katrina for her reflections. I should mention as well that we are just a small sample of the many authors that were involved in the creation of this book and the collaboration through many, many years. So many of them are online with us. So a big thank you to you as well. And I'd like to particularly single out Tara Reddington from RI for all the work and support in putting this event together this evening, and indeed for RI for graciously hosting the event. Tara has put the link to the website, and the recordings will be available at some stage tomorrow. So there's some fabulous stuff coming through there in the chat. We might keep the room open for a little while, just so people have the opportunity just to type their ideas into the chat for a few moments. Thank you to everybody who's joined us from right across the world. It's been a very stimulating and hopeful, indeed actively hopeful evening. So thank you very much.